Yeah, okay. I mean, you could use that, but I'll just start from here, and then I'll just have you over there. Is that okay? Yeah. It'd be better. Yeah. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Javid Ahmad. I'm a NAD resident fellow here at the South Asia Center and a fellow at a Model War Institute at West Point. Excuse me. Can you just leave this one here? Yeah. So we'll have it. Thank you. Just leave. Our discussion today will be on the non-military components of President Trump's new Afghan strategy that was announced last August. The new strategy obviously has both the military and the non-military components. But while the military side of the strategy has been greatly and excessively debated, then the civilian and non-military components of the strategy has received little attention. After the Afghan National Unity Government was inaugurated in 2014, the Afghan government embarked upon an ambitious reform agenda known as realizing self-reliance. The objective was to fundamentally change the way the Afghan government operate. This marked the beginning of the so-called transformation decade, which will likely run until 2024. But as part of the reform and self-reliance agenda, the Afghan government has so far made considerable progress towards improving public administration, including building the capacity and leadership of civilian management, making important reforms to civil services in human resources, as well as in addressing formal and official corruption. But there are still challenges that remain, from a struggling economy to a somewhat dysfunctional internal politics, to governance deficiencies, criminal patronage, as well as abuse of power. But pursuing a complex public administration reform agenda in an increasingly difficult political environment and volatile security conditions, coupled with a deeply entrenched criminal patronage network, is a Herculean task, which we'll discuss today. And to do that, we have a distinguished panel with us today. I believe you have the full bios of our speakers, but let me just briefly introduce them before we begin. On my immediate left, we have Nadery, who is the head of the Afghan Civil Service Commission, is the leading agency, Afghanistan agency for the civil service reform. Among his other roles, he is also chief advisor to President Ghani on public and strategic affairs, and is also Afghanistan's ambassador at large for freedom of expression. And then we have in my far left, not ideologically, is Ambassador Cunningham, who's a well-known face in Washington. He's a close Afghanistan watcher who served as U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan from 2012 to 2014, and then before that as a deputy ambassador in Kabul, and is now my colleague at the Atlantic Council. He's a senior non-resident fellow at the South Asia Center. And then in the middle, finally, Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown, who's also a long-term Afghanistan hand, is currently a senior fellow at Foreign Policy and the Center for 21st Century Security Intelligence at Brookings, and she has done some excellent work on Afghanistan. The format of today's event would be we'll have Nader speak briefly about some of the broad reforms in public administration at both national and subnational level that the Afghan government has made so far, and he will then join us at the panel for a moderated discussion, following which I'll open it up to a Q&A. This event is on the record, by the way, and with that, Nader, the floor is yours.
There's too many wires in my pocket. Just seeing Mr. Andrabi here and being wired is a little bit scary. Mr. Andrabi is one of our intelligence officer. Used to be. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Javid and the Atlantic Council, for providing this opportunity to speak to you today. As as you read and hear the headlines of the media, the reports coming off Afghanistan is mostly of wars and violence, but there are other side to that story also. And as an ambassador at large for freedom of expression, I would not give up or lose any opportunity to bring about the story that has happened yesterday, the story of an attack that made the headlines of both national and international news outlets, an attack on a major TV station in Kabul. This was not the first attack on press by the terrorist groups. Daesh have claimed responsibility for it, what they call ISI or ISS, or an outlet of ISI. Could be the same. They have claimed responsibility for it. Many of you may have looked at the feeds from social media or media headlines that the attack did happen. Some souls were perished, some courageous individuals, journalists, producers, directors at that TV station have lost their life or were injured. But what you do not see in the media and you do not hear about is the stories that just after that attack, what has happened to those people and to the ability of a state to prevent or at least to contain such a cowardly attack. Yesterday I spent some time talking to the journalists and to the chief editor of the television who was attacked. The story that he told me, I think worth sharing it here, which does not capture any airwave. He told me that how quick it was for the special operation and our commandos to arrive just after the attack, that one of the suicide attackers have blown up himself. He told me the story of how diverse and different, with different language, these soldiers were of our own, speaking Pashto, Dari, with the accent of Hazara, with the accent of Uzbek, but how they were trying to shield civilians and protect those journalists and the workers at the TV station and cleaning room by room each of the rooms of the compound from the terrorists. An hour after the attack was cleaned, the attackers were cleaned out of the site, the TV was back on air. Safi, the anchor, the news anchor, whose hands were still tied in bandage, she was badly injured, was on air giving back the news. The resilience that is there and the sense of defiance that you can see in civilian institutions that grown up and institutionalized throughout these many years is a story to be told and is unique. What's much more important is the message that Safi concluded that news item that yesterday. He said, Taliban, or Daesh, whoever you were, you attacked us, you want to stop us, you want to take away the freedom that we have gained, and you want us to give up with the institution of democracy, however fragile it is. But here is what I'm telling you, that we are not going to give up. We are not afraid, and you would see us on this screen talking about everything impartially. And that's a story of defiance, a story of resilience, a story of how institutions have built up and gotten strength. Our fragile but young democracy is on the shoulders of those civilians as well as on those soldiers, and those story needs to be acknowledged and heard. As Javid said, there is a lot of talk about the military side of the strategy, the United States strategy, and the rest of the international community in stabilizing Afghanistan and fighting the terrorists. There is less talk these days about the civilian side of it. The strategy, as you all know, has three components: the military, the diplomatic, and the economy. This time, one of the fundamental elements, which is a key to the stability of the country, is the civilian side and the reform and delivery of services to public, which is taken up by the Afghan government itself. As part of that commitment, the Afghan government has entered, some of you have seen and know about it, a compact with the United States, which is in addition to what we have with the Brussels commitment and other mutual accountability frameworks that we have signed in. This compact is primarily focused on civilian development and the civilian side to get stability through the work of civilian institutions. The question that this compact partially addresses, but we as an Afghan government, accountable to our own population and also accountable to our international partners who provide blood and treasure of their taxpayer and their population to us, is how we can make sure that the institutions of public service are actually delivering services to the local population at the very remote areas. How we can create a conducive environment for our economy, that it can provide opportunities and foundation for private sector growth and for the economy's growth. How we can transform that very public administration from a strong man's domination to the institution-centric. So there's no more an individual more matters than the institution, but rather the institutions are the protector of people and matters the more. And at the same time, the question to be answered through the work that we have committed ourselves to our population, how we can break the vicious cycle of corruption, nepotism, and politicization out of our public institution, or to remove the institutional capture of our public sector by elite and by the interest groups. Now, what we had was an organizational culture, a culture of governance in our country where it was only serving the interest of the elite, primarily served the interest of the elite. Now, changing that dynamic to make sure that there is a different culture of governance that primarily focuses on the interest and the services to be delivered to the ordinary people. Not to be very much in abstract terms, to give you some very tangible examples, we have just passed and adopted the next year physical budget. This budget has gone through different processes of reform itself to make sure that it's focused on the long-term development of the country, but also brings about a budget discipline. As part of that, my institution was tasked to look at the constraints that our budget was not properly utilized. Most of the years, as most of you follow Afghanistan, our institutions could not spend 20% or 30% or maximum 40% of our developmental budget. And that had a significant impact both on poverty and also on development of the country. What we did, after looking into it, to the different aspects of the public institutions, we identified one particular institution, the departments of procurement, throughout all the government institutions. We found there was no TUR. It was captured by the political elites' family members. There was less competency, and therefore there was a significant amount of corruption. Contracts were not given to the companies with the right qualification to deliver developmental projects, but to those who were connected. And therefore, the elements of the obligation under the contract on the public sector was mostly not met because it was expected the companies to provide bribes and favors. Now, what we did, we took 3 months to standardize them, reform them, for the first time put TURs for those departments and for each individual working in there. But while you put systems and processes and you don't have the right people to run them, it's still captured by the political elite. We needed to get rid of those individuals also. And therefore we put on an open competition for the first time 700 positions, 699 positions of procurement departments across the government ministries and department. In course of 10 days, we received 41,000 applications. It was an online application process. We minimized the human intervention. Just a short list, you can imagine, of 30,000 people. And once we went down, doing further qualification scrutiny, it became a list of 8,000 people to go to an exam. And they went to an exam. We had to have them go through processes like biometrics and other elements. And the result was that 11 people were competing only for one seat. And some of my colleagues were concerned that how this would then satisfy the rest of the 10 people. They will be unhappy. And my response was, if we are transparent, if we could run the process credible, and we provide access for scrutiny to media, to civil society, to monitor it, people will be satisfied. We announced the result last Thursday. 700 people were selected. There was no single complaint or dissatisfaction from the rest of those competing. Now they will go through an orientation and then some training, and then they will start to run our procurement department. The second brief story is about the rule of law and the justice and the grievances that pushes most of the time our population to the hands of the Taliban and their affiliates. Because it was said that the formal justice system is never speedy. It's slow, and therefore people may go to seek addressing their grievances to Taliban. And that's changing, and that's changing in real terms. The Office of Prosecutor in our country, most of you have been there or follow, was known as the most notorious one, highly corrupt, not trustworthy. A citizen was afraid if there was a case that they needed to go and seek remedy at the prosecutor's office. That's not anymore the case. What we have now, a reformist Attorney General who have gone step by step through a holistic process of reform of the institution. And the first thing he did was to change the dynamic of access of individuals and citizens to the offices. It's an open office now, every Monday from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. Hundreds of people come, they wait on the line, they take a ticket of their turn, and they show up at the place where the Attorney General sits with his entire crew of advisors and aides and others. People get a hearing directly to the prosecutor. And that made some people unhappy, and I heard some politicians saying, well, their business have gone down because their business was to get commission from certain individuals who had issues at the prosecutor's office, and they were facilitating those individuals to be brought to the prosecutor himself to hear them. Now there's a direct link between citizens and the prosecutor, and therefore there's no need for somebody to run a commissioning business on the grievances of the population. And there are politicians who are loud, and they are attacking the government, sometimes rightly, but most of the time because of the threat they see of their space, that their institutional capture and their corrupt practices are becoming limited or diminished and removed. I would stop here. I'm sure there are so many questions, but I would leave you with this last message that I always gave to my colleagues and also those at the public sector or wherever we work to improve the services. Our soldiers are fighting at the battlefields. Our national security forces are giving blood every day. Some of the figures are really heart-crunching. The stability of our country does not come only through those battlefields, through those military means. And I tell all the time to my colleagues that if we want to see Afghanistan stabilized, one of the only way is that to utilize the space that's created by the sacrifices of our forces and utilize them to make sure that we have a public administration, a civil service sector that delivers to the population down to the district level and delivers it with equality and proportionate to the ability of our state. And only that will bring stability to the country and a long-term stability. I thank you.
Thank you, Nader, for that good overview of Afghanistan reform process, particularly in the civil service, in public administration, the challenges, the priorities, and also the future outlook. The progress that the Afghan government and your agency in particular has made so far has been monumental, but there's also a wider recognition that the challenges are also many that needs to be overcome. But let me start with the most obvious one, and you hinted that in your remarks as well, which is that the Afghan government is testing a new hiring system, a new civil service hiring system, one that's gradually but steadily moving away, what you call from a strongman influence and rule to a more institutionally driven, and one that's merit-based. And the objective here, obvious, which is to fundamentally change Afghanistan's deeply entrenched culture of nepotism, favoritism, corruption, and patronage. And the government objective is also to establish a legitimate, stable, sustainable, non-political, service-oriented, and accountable civil service in the frame of good governance. And it's obvious that your agency's progress is significant, but it has, in many cases, also fallen short of expectations. Particularly on on the recruitment side, where a large number of Afghan government positions on the provincial level and the central government level remains unfilled, from deputy provincial governors to district governors to administrative roles in various ministries and agencies. And two, there are also duplication and overlap of functions and roles among civil service ministries in agencies, both in Kabul but also across provinces. Can you explain this somewhat sluggish reform process in the civil service, and maybe explain why is that and what is your agency doing about it?
Well, thank you very much. A very good question. When you reform, you need to be consistently moving from some of the immediate short-term need for building confidence and trust to the institutions and making it a little bit more functional, to also between this objective and some of the midterm to long-term objectives. And as you do that, you have to do it parallel, and you have to move consistently between all these three objectives, because some of those would require 5 to 10 years to entirely change the public administration, not only in our country with this colossal amount of challenges and the legacy of the 3 waves of political influence and ideology of our public sector. And therefore the population would not be willing to stand and to have that patience to stand and to see that long-term outcome of the reform. And therefore you need to address some of the immediate issues that concerns population. Now, in terms of the vacant positions and some of the acting positions, I'm happy to report that in the past, it's now 7 months that I have been in that job, and my colleagues who have joined as the Board of Commissioners, it's almost 3 months that they're there. So it's a new team that's operating. But I'm happy to report that the first thing in the past a few months we have done is to identify those institutional overlaps. A study is complete, and we are hoping that at least in 10 ministries with more revenue generating and more spending, to be able to review their structures. In the past, what it was, structures were created for individuals, and those individuals were then defining a function for that department. And we're changing that entire methodology of state institutions operation. We define the function of each of these institutions. We also define their functions in line to the Afghanistan's National Peace and Development Strategy. And then those functions will define the structure. And through that, we will eliminate at least 10 ministries and departments overlap, organizational overlap and mandate overlap throughout next year, 2018. That's a priority. But as part of that, what we did, we have looked into where are ghost civil servants and how many of those we can identify immediately, and where are the waste time in our public sector. I'm also happy to announce that on Thursday, before there were 2 before that I departed to Washington, we announced 17,000 vacant positions to be filled. These were not ordinary positions. In a sense, a critical component of the public sector that delivers services to the population. Grade 5 and grade 6 and 5, the bottom of the pyramid of the public administration, who are directly in touch with the population. But because they were not presenting a center of power or demonstrating power to the senior politicians and the senior officials in the government in the past, they were not having any interest to fill them. And that's why services were not received to the population in a good way. Now this is going to address the process of competition of Begin, the online application and hard copies of Begin throughout the country. And some say it's a revolution for the first time, that you identify the waste and the ghost civil servants and you clean them up and you put them in a public competition. But we are not going to stop there. These numbers does not make our institutions only effective. We have to make substantial changes, and those substantial changes are both in procedures and rules and definition of functions, but also in the capacities that would require to come. But we had to address the immediate concern of population, 40% of unemployment. The public sector is one of the major or the only provider of job, and a huge bulk of youth population. This 17,000 is going to be followed by another 8,000. We are not making the public sector even bigger, but we are reviewing and identifying some of the waste positions to be eliminated from the structure. So we have a leaner government public sector where our physical space can afford it. That will follow. And we identified those both ghost but also vacant positions on grade 4, 3, 2, and 1. And it will be followed in 3 months. The deputy governors and the district governors, and a lot of them were vacant or on acting. And I'm also glad to report that we just completed last week appointment of all of those district governors, and we developed a mechanism of bottom-up where the district governors will be chosen by the community councils at the district level, and 7 names will be proposed to the Civil Service Commission and IDLG. We will then do a background check and qualification, and also our National Directors of Security will do a security clearance of them, and then we will propose to the President only 3 names that he would choose one from them. The process has gone speeded up. It's just the beginning of it.
Let me ask you one question or another issue that you didn't mention in your remarks, which is that in the past reforms, including the civil service, have largely been donor-driven. And one of the consequences of that was obvious, which was the establishment of parallel administrative structures across government. And those parallel administrative structures have largely been autonomous. But despite the fact that the National Unity Government is the largest employer in Afghanistan today, is there a plan in your agency to reform or maybe at some point mainstream some of these autonomous administrative structure that often operate without your agencies or the government's jurisdiction?
Absolutely. One of the key priority for us is to get rid of the project-based approach within the public sector. The project-based approach has been a donor-driven, short-term projects that has been developed parallel to the ministries. And once the project ended, the funding has have ended, the institutional memory and the setup has gone also, disappeared. There was nothing left in most cases for the institution itself. Ministry of Mine is a clear example of it. Huge amount of money was spent through different contracting parties, generous donor contributions, but it was a failure first on our part in the past, that there was no local leadership of understanding that these projects may be helpful in the short term, but it will be sustainable only if you integrate it within the public sector institutions and then utilize whatever resources that is available there. But also on part of our development partners who have not brought in the experiences and knowledge and lessons learned from other development scenarios, and therefore it was mostly burning more money and increasing the burn rate of the budgets. A good example will be the Civil Service Commission itself. In 2013, a project of around $130 million, Mr. Usmani could correct me, was contributed to civil service reform. It was a USAID and a number of other donors joined. When I went to see the Civil Service Institute, what I saw, the remaining of that project, was a junkyard at the back of the building of the institute, where there was all these generators, very, very big generators, and other junks that remain. Now we are changing those. Currently, a project we have with the World Bank, Capacity for Result. It's a $350 million of a project, and it was very scattered. It had two units. One was operating with the Ministry of Finance. One was operating at the Civil Service Commission. That in itself was a demonstration of dysfunctionality, not a reform, and could not attract any encouragement for reform. The first thing we did, the first month that I've arrived at the Commission, the President issued a decree. The two units were combined, and it's now in one place at the Civil Service Commission. The second thing that we did as part of the transition, that the support units of the project are now being integrated within the Commission itself, where there's not a separate finance, where there's not separate procurement or a separate HR department for that project. It is integrated within the Commission itself. And as we go to the next year, as we implement the next generation of reforms, that will be an integral part of the Civil Service Commission.
Great. Ambassador Cunningham, in your time as ambassador in Kabul, I suppose you followed the civil service reform and other Afghan government reform process closely, and I suppose you still do. But how do you assess, evaluate the reform in Afghan public administration so far?
Well, I think that it's important, first of all, to be cognizant of the fact that what Nader and his colleagues and President Ghani and the Chief Executive Abdullah and others are trying to do is probably the hardest part of building stability over a period of time. I think the most important thing that Nader said in his comments was the remark that he made at the very end about the need to use the space created by the security forces to strengthen the state and to reform economic and development and political processes in the interest of producing long-term stability. I agree completely. Doing the reform part of that, whether it's in the economy or on the government side, is probably the hardest part of the spectrum of things that need to be done and take the longest amount of time. And they really do. It's really hard. For those of you who haven't actually tried to do that work, it is incredibly difficult, particularly in a struggling place like Afghanistan. So it's the greatest challenge that confronts all of us who are trying to build a longer-term picture of stability in Afghanistan, but it's also essential that the work continue. So Nader addressed some of the successes that some of the progress that this administration is making, that President Ghani is making. I think there are some good signs, but as we all know, there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, and it's not something that can be solved very easily. And this is something that we Americans and the other members of the donor community need to be cognizant of and keep in mind as we go forward, which is this has been for some time principally an Afghan responsibility. It's not something that Americans or others can do for Afghans. And I saw this evolve during the time that I was there and after I left at the end of 2014. When I first got to Afghanistan at the end of the middle of 2011, it was the height of the so-called surge, both civilian and military, and we had people all over the country. Everybody was spending money, and there wasn't a broken window in the country that we weren't trying to fix. We, the international community. That started to change pretty rapidly after I got there as the military presence started to contract, and we became aware that the civilian presence was going to contract as well. But I think it's taken a while conceptually to get to the point to really take to heart the proposition that the ability of the international community no matter how much money it has at its disposal, to actually get inside the Afghan or any other system for that matter and do lasting things is very, it's difficult. It's limited ability without having the kind of partners that I think we have in the Afghan government and with people like Nader. It's the Afghans themselves who have to show the determination and the commitment and the longevity of vision, and yes, eventually the political wisdom in their political system to get this work done. And I think that's a consistent message that all of us need to be sending to our Afghan friends, that if there's going to be a lasting stability in Afghanistan, it won't be created from the outside. We can help. It needs to be created from the inside, and that demands responsibility from the Afghan political class and the elites to get that done.
Great. Well, Vanda, you have, in your writings, you have mentioned President Trump's new strategy for Afghanistan, his overall decision to remain in Afghanistan with a somewhat enlarged military capacity is to a large extent correct, but you've also been critical of Washington's somewhat downgraded importance of Afghan governments in political issues, and you've called it, and I saw something along the lines of, and I quote, deeply misguided, especially given the fact that there's governing deficiencies in many parts of the country that remains unaddressed and under-examined, and there's also widespread abuses that the U.S. government has not taken a firm stand on. Do you think Trump's de-emphasis, or the strategy's de-emphasis on Afghan political issues, could prove to be a fatal flaw in this new strategy? And so what are some of the specific governance reforms that you think the Afghan government needs to make in now?
Well, thank you. Indeed, I believe that deprioritizing the need to improve governance in Afghanistan would be a critical and fatal mistake. President Trump's strategy rollout speech very much hinted at that approach, though subsequently there's been great effort by various members of the administration, including, of course, Secretary Tillerson, including during his recent visit to Afghanistan, to re-emphasize the need to improve governance and to stress how vital it is for the success of the country, for stability, for reduction in violence. I am very encouraged, though not at all surprised, to hear Nader to make it a crucial element of his remarks, emphasizing how Taliban's support, and I would say sustainment, really its capacity to remain so successfully entrenched, is precisely because many Afghans believe that the governance that the Taliban provides, brutal, limited, in fundamental ways not accountable, is nonetheless preferable in its predictability, in its much lesser corruption than governance that is provided by many officials in the government and those associated with the government. So whatever military improvements are necessary and needed, and they need to take place, Nader spoke about the success of the Special Operations Forces, Afghan Special Operations Forces, and it's crucial to see other parts of the military, let alone the police and law enforcement more broadly, to reach the level of the Special Operations Forces, need to take place more broadly in governance. Now, Ambassador Cunningham is absolutely right that no one can do it for the Afghans, that the Afghans have to realize that. And I often get in trouble with my Afghan friends when they place the problems on Pakistan, and Pakistan is a major problem, major thorn and problematic actor in Afghanistan, no doubt about that. However, at the end of the day, it is the governance and misgovernance and the political processes that allow the Taliban to remain entrenched and robust and resilient and rebuild itself. And so the work that Nader is doing, excruciatingly difficult as it is, threatening many in the political elite, and in some cases even can be life-threatening for those who are doing it honestly and with courage, is critical for success. But I do want to say, I do want to echo Ambassador Cunningham's words. The issue is not simply the dysfunction of the bureaucracy and the governance processes and misprocesses that take place. The crucial underlying dysfunction is the political dysfunction, with the political elite still believing that the state is essentially a mafia bazaar, something that one seeks to get advantages of to escape the rule of law, to get exceptions from law enforcement for oneself and one clique, and that constantly generating political crises and constantly engaging in brinksmanship is a way to get appointments, is a way to get, for one's friends, is to get payoffs in the form of militias, whatever the latest label of the irregular forces is, such as the territorial army, etc. And as long as the political elite in Afghanistan believes that they can get ahead by constant political crisis making and brinksmanship, fundamental governance improvements or fundamental governance in general will simply not take place. And so I feel that we are very much not in that state, that the mindset of the elite has fundamentally not changed. And indeed, we are heading into the 2018 election year, parliamentary election, but already much of Afghanistan's political life is about not governance, but it's about the upcoming 2019 election. And that's sucking oxygen, energy, capacity out of the best-minded reforms. Now, the United States cannot make the processes and the political dysfunction to go away, but it must insist that crucial assistance will be conditions to improvements in not just in governance itself, in official governance through ministries, but also in improvements in political processes. And that is hard, because just as the Afghan government faces the dilemma of putting out fires that are burning, whether this is greater territorial reach of the Taliban or the vast unemployment and the medium and long-term necessary governance reform that must take place, so the United States and the international community is constantly on the horns of the dilemma of how much to put pressure, lean on, cut off aid, and how much to be scared of by the immediate fire repercussion this could mean. So yes, I would say that governance is really at the core. Governance and political processes are absolutely at the core of success. They need to be what the Afghan elite embraces and realizes is the issue. Just let the country be governed, as opposed to have constantly ministers who challenge the government in which they are ministers. And equally for the United States, that must be the core of the strategy.
But is it wise for the United States to involve itself in internal Afghan government governance issues and political matters, especially now that the Afghan government is increasingly taking ownership of its internal processes and political issues, as well as the reform process?
Well, Ambassador Cunningham is the one who can talk about the excruciating difficulties of balancing of how much engagement at one point becomes intrusion, at what point there is ownership, and of course there is much criticism in Afghanistan about the national unity government as something that was imposed by Washington on Afghanistan. Clearly, the ownership needs to be Afghans. That does not, however, mean that the United States and the international community should not make clear what its objectives and priorities are, and especially those that are crucially tied to success of the country. That doesn't mean that the United States should dictate specific policies, procedures, or perhaps specific personalities, certainly not as a standard approach. But clearly, if an entire ministry or the procurement department of a ministry is captured to the extent that vast amount of money, 40, 50, 60%, are being diverted to personal pockets or to political patronage, then those might be very appropriate circumstances for the international community to suspend particular lines of funding or make clear that other lines of funding will not be renewed unless the situation is rectified. Ideally, it would be the Afghans themselves to figure out how to rectify so that governance services are being delivered and there is not vast corruption and nepotism.
Nader, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I fully agree on the emphasis of governance for the stability. And it's always good to look at how you sequence which part of the process of stabilization. But I slightly disagree on some of the points my good friend Vanda said. Just the first thing, a fact-checking, and that is the Taliban's reach is now reversing. So it's not a consistent, a continued expansion of the reach of the Taliban. The reversal began throughout this summer, especially at the end of the summer and the beginning of the fall. The fighting season did not end yet. It's more an urban attack that they do carry, but places, as an example, the Horak in Kandahar that was at the hand of Taliban for so many years and recently is now being taken back and pushed back. Places in Helmand, the Taliban are pushed back in places that they had, at least in some places, three past years. In Kunduz, the situation has changed, but also in some parts of Badakhshan, we have the Taliban being pushed back. The kind of open front-line battle that they were carrying out is not anymore to the extent that they are. It was last year at the same time. Now, would that trend of reversing would continue is required for how much time we will get throughout this winter for a revitalization of our forces. This year, for the first time, 5 of our army corps are not badly damaged as it was last year. In most places, they are in a very good shape, as rating, especially in places in the Army Corps in Helmand and which was affected in 2016 so badly that in terms of all the checklists to be checked if they are in good shape or not, they were below 30%. But this year they're above 70%. So that's these are the new dynamics. Our ability to of forces to fight, our ability of the in terms of having the forces, especially the Air Force, the limited number, is changing the dynamic on the field. However, there's more urban warfare, there's more attack in the cities, and we do see the risk of increased suicide attacks and sophisticated attacks and complex attacks in the city. So that one issue. On a separate note, back into the political elite, I fully agree that our political elites have never been responsible, and especially recently, as the pie have shrinked in terms of resources, the amount of international donor funding have increased, the projects and the contracts through different means of companies and others they have had is shrinking. They wanted to continue through the state and public institutions to seek rent. And that rent seeking and also the brinksmanship and asking, blackmailing continued on number of fronts. But there's one difference in the way the government is handling them. It's not as it was 3 years ago. This administration, the president, is not giving into those demands of blackmailing. One of the things that this administration, especially the president, have continually been criticized, unfortunately, by some of our international partners, pressing him that you have to give in to these brinksmanship. You have to give in to these outcries of certain political elite. If you don't give in, they're going to challenge the state, they're going to challenge the government, and the government will collapse. Well, now we are 3 years into this. He hardly gave in to some of those demands. He mostly didn't give in. The government did not collapse. It still is there. And more confidence of the population is shown, especially to the way that the government have handled these blackmailing. The recent Asia Foundation survey is a good testimony to this. Last year, the confidence of public to the direction the country have had and the performance of the government was 27. This year, it's close to 33. So it's a jump of almost 6%. And that shows that a majority of population endorses the kind of stopping, giving in to the blackmailing. And if we continue like this, these days again, the government is under enormous pressure to keep certain individuals in certain places. A government within government, the government official, senior official, you rightly say, is standing up and becoming an opposition at the same time. And when the government want to demonstrate the authority and to make a decision to distinguish between a political opposition and an official serving the government, there are demands from some of our international partners that it shouldn't be done because there are concerns. And it is time for all of us to really do a proper assessment of the level of threat, where those threats exist. What is the extent of those threats an individual or an interest group can pose to the stability of the government and the country? What more they could add to the already troubled situation politically? And if the government takes a reform agenda, certain individuals will be threatened by it and would stand. And the expectation of us as the Afghan government is that it's our job, the problem, we own it. It's our mandate and responsibility to clean it up and to work and to make it functional. But we do expect our international partners who are vastly invested with us in this shared fight to understand the changing dynamic and consistently take stock of the changing environment there.
Ambassador Cunningham, Afghanistan faces two important tests in the next 2 years. One next year in July, the parliamentary elections, and then in following year in 2019, we'll have the presidential elections. What concrete steps can the United States take to further intensify its political engagement with Kabul, especially with respect to improving governance in political processes?
I think the getting through the next phase of the electoral process is going to be extremely challenging. Everybody knows that. I would notice this is not just an American engagement; it's an international engagement in the development and carrying out of the political process and the elections going forward. Finding the right balance between international engagement and advocacy and Afghan process and capabilities is a very challenging thing to do. And you have sometimes competing imperatives. You have the Americans in the international community who are pushing for certain things and certain decisions to be made, and you have the Afghans themselves who are grappling with the real world implications and complications of what they need to do, not just politically but administratively and conceptually to implement and carry out the elections. We suffered through that, all of us, I mean not just the Americans, through that in the last round of elections, which were obviously very difficult, but I continue to think they were part of an ongoing process, and we have to expect that that's going to continue to be difficult to work through this. There's a real challenge now with the structure of the Independent Election Commission. I think that needs to be sorted out. A lot of decisions need to be made by the Afghans themselves and by their international partners who are going to be expected again to provide funding and advice to carry through the elections. I obviously can't predict how that's going to proceed, except that I expect it's again going to be a difficult process, a difficult discussion. But I go back to what I said before, and I want to inject, since I'm basically an optimistic person, and one was while I was there. I want to just step back for 1 second and say that the picture of the political process and system has some positive elements as well, I would say. The national unity government has stood. It was always expected it was going to be very difficult to work, as it is in any kind of coalition government, and we are certainly having our own difficulties in this country with our own political system. I think there's a certain amount of humility that should be shown here. But the government has held, it stood together under very great stress, politically, economically, and otherwise. There are signs that certain aspects of the situation in Afghanistan have turned a corner and are improving. The economy is starting to perform better. Governance is improving. The Attorney General's office is, I must say, a major improvement from what I can see and understand. The security forces have held. They haven't cracked, under great stress. I think with the new Trump strategy, which I think is basically right, that will improve over the course of the next year. That is the performance of the security forces and their situation. So there are positive indicators here as well. And another one is, despite all the criticisms by individuals or factions in Afghanistan, with the possible exception of President Karzai, former President Karzai, almost every leader that I've seen attacking the government has at some point then stepped back and said, no, we are not trying to bring down the government. That'll be a complicated political dynamic going forward, but I still think there is a fundamental recognition that a certain degree of political stability and performance is required. And that's the kernel, I think, or the core that needs to be developed going forward in the elections. There's a systems point that I learned a long time ago that an engineer taught me, which is that something is sustainable until it's not. You don't know when a process that's having difficulty but is being sustained is suddenly going to reach a tipping point and it's not sustainable anymore. And that's a lesson that I hope our Afghan friends will take to heart, because there is still a great deal of international, even today as we speak, NATO is about to announce its decision to increase the force presence in Afghanistan, which has personal and financial implications, as the United States is doing. So that international support from many directions, from major donors, the international community, international organizations, the United States is still there. But it needs to be nurtured by the Afghans going forward, and I hope they will keep that in mind as they head into this election process.
Vanda, let me ask you one last question before I open it up. Trump's new strategy makes a modest military surge in Afghanistan. Do you think there is a need for a corresponding civilian surge, or kind of mini civilian surge, or political surge in Afghanistan as well? Or if not, then how do you see Washington's engagement with Kabul in the next 2 years?
I would perhaps not phrase it as surge, rather than emphasis and crucially the ability to get out into the field. Both the Afghan government at its national level and very much the international community today are greatly constricted by insecurity in the country and many fewer available protection troops to move around. That's an enormous limitation of really understanding what's going on in the processes. So I would not perhaps focus on increasing the size of the personnel at Western embassies, for example, but figuring out how, given the difficult security situation and the limitations that national legislature puts on willingness to expose diplomats and civilian personnel to risk, how to get out into the field, how to get outside of Kabul, how to really have visibility of what's going on in provinces and not be dependent pretty much on Afghan government interlocutors only in Kabul. That to me is a huge vulnerability in a situation, and here I'll push back against Nader a bit, where it might be that in accounting terms, the Taliban presence is lesser in the territory that they quote unquote control, whatever control means. The far more fundamental issue is the perception of how one can go about human security, what kind of freedom of movement there is, how people, whether they are Afghan and crucially Afghans, but also the international community, can physically engage in the country. And that is the sense, at least when I was there last time in July, certainly not as recently and not as exposed as Nader is, that very much that has become an issue that's greatly constricted. People fear many forms of insecurity, including criminality, including middle-level officials that, and perhaps even lower than middle-level officials who work in Kabul feel greatly insecure, exposed to kidnapping for a rather limited amount of money. And it is broad insecurity, of course, that militant groups very much exploit to their advantage, that crucially limits the ability to implement, monitor, and sustain governance reforms, but that also deeply influence the understanding that the international community can have of what's going on. And this level of insecurity will, of course, be a critical factor in the parliamentary and the national elections. I would just add that it would be a surprisingly good outcome if the presidential elections did not produce a major political crisis, and if they produce a real winner that is seen as easily announced right after the elections and accepted. And so both the Afghan political elite and the international community will need to think very hard about how they will handle a prolonged crisis and what kind of risks it brings. At what point does the constant brinkmanship miscalculates and tips the balance over, over the brink? But my bottom line is, I don't think it's simply a matter of more international civilians presence. It's far more important matter of how to get them out into the field and outside of lockdown in their offices and solely engaging with a limited set of Afghan official interlocutors, if that.
Thank you. All right, so let's open it up. Please wait until I recognize you, and please state your name before you ask your question. It would also be great if you could keep your comments and questions brief. Right there, please.
Thank you. Ron Newman. Hi, Nader. I just wanted to echo Vanda's comment on getting out, but to note that that is not just a security problem, that is a problem of American political will, and it's a Washington problem. And if we haven't got the guts to get out, we won't let our people get out. End comment. Nader, thank you for coming. Getting Afghans to believe in what you're doing may be almost as hard as accomplishing it. The level of cynicism and disbelief is enormously high, and it's magnified for most foreign observers by the fact that the political class has every reason to magnify it in the case of what you're doing. So, two-part question. How do you feel you're doing in public awareness? How broad as well, if you can have any sense of measuring that? And where do you see your biggest challenge in winning credibility?
Well,
yeah, just in line with that, like, also, how do you balance the division between the political and the civil service within your recruitment? the division between the political and technical side?
Thank you, Ambassador Newman. First, to start with your question, to improve the civil service, and especially the recruitment part of that, it has to be depoliticized. What was affecting it was the politicization of it, and throughout 3 waves of political ideologies since 1980, and that is gone. Now, we have political appointees, and in the political appointees, does not primarily comes directly under the Civil Service Commission. However, when it goes to the sub-national governance, there are portfolios that are out of the 8 grade civil services structure, and it's called mostly political or above these or out of the administrative grading. There we provide primarily the analysis and the background checking and the qualification, but the final decision is of the president, especially when it comes to those political appointees and the Constitution. Now, Ambassador Newman, you're very, very much right. A population that throughout a number of decades, they've grown skeptical of the public institutions because of the conduct of these institutions, because it was only at one time serving only the interest of a political party, and on the other time it become a share of the benefit of the factions and the different political actors, and access to the public sector has become almost, if not impossible, very, very, very difficult for an ordinary Afghan without any connection even to the junior level. Now, telling them that from now on, you're not going to be needing a member of parliament to endorse you or to vote for you, or a political elite, is going to be very difficult. It's already very difficult. Reform always is very challenging, and in a situation like us, with that historical legacy that we have of many decades of those institutions, it's hard for people to believe that it's really happening. But it requires a consistent and many layers of engagement from our side, and messaging and public information. What we try to do is to learn each time from one step that we take, and then expand the amount of information dissemination that we have had. Increasing town hall discussions, inviting people, and when I go back, there will be one of the biggest one where we will have the families of especially the students of the university or others who are interested to come and engage in a debate with us. We increase our presence of the talk shows. Luckily, the crowd of the commissioners that I have, the 8 of them, each of them brilliant and a leader on their own right, they're out there in the media, in the talk shows, to speak and to explain to people. We have expanded our use of the social media, and finally, after a long time resisting to not be on Twitter, I had to have a Twitter account and to be on Twitter, just to get the messages as much as we can. Each of the steps is open. We opened it to civil society scrutiny. We invite them there throughout the process. We opened up all our systems, even if it's an online system, for the media to come. We're launching a new recruiting tool. It's an online recruiting tool. We provide to the organizations, even to citizens who wishes to have a username and a password, who can only review the information of the application and the processes. We don't expect that people will immediately believe on us, and it has to be kept, and the pace need to be kept, the messaging need to be continued, to be disseminated, and we need to prove each time that it's happening. It's happening. Now, the 17,000 positions that were announced is the 3rd major recruitments that the Civil Service Commission makes. And this has already created a debate, a national debate, because this has never had any precedence. And not only the talk shows, the radios and televisions, but ordinary people who have engaged in discussing this. They're slowly believing it, but it's not yet there. It requires a consistent work and a lot of more hard work. Now, those who are opposing, some of them who has a sense of a national responsibility, they feel their burden is lesser now. Some of the MPs, as an example, come to us and say, well, thank you, now we don't have to respond to our constituency and taking people to the different government institutions for finding them a job. Whoever comes to us, we tell them, well, now you don't ask, go and apply for the position, which makes us much more encouraged and delighted. But there are many others who really felt intimidated. The procurement one have created a huge issue. It was, a lot of people were telling us it's explosive. This is going to destroy the commission and all of you. They will find a way to destroy the process. The day when, the night before the exam, there were 15 members of the parliament and a number of others who, I was told, have gathered, and one of the key discussion in there was how we can stop it. As we take every step, as it becomes more difficult and intimidative to the space that others were using it, the challenges to our team, to our people, to our staff will become, and all of those who would want to see it a reform. But what makes us move on is the kind of response the public gives, and what gives us more courage is the kind of political will demonstrated from the highest level of the government. And in the most difficult time, we go to the president, and he says, "Leave the rest of it to me," and I would take the heat. And that's the key element of taking steps forward.
Right here.
This is Ali. Nader is an expert on elections, so I would like to know what is going to happen during 2019 elections.
I may be an expert on election, but I'm not a person to predict if you're talking about the outcome of the 2019. However, the process and the system and the vision of the government, what to happen with the election, there is a significant amount of emphasis both by the president and the CEO to make sure that this election, the parliamentarian election, is to be better, way better than the previous one, and then to prepare and to do whatever it takes to get close to, if not perfect, but something way better, highly acceptable, credible, close to the free and fair election standards. The preparation has to be made in a view for 2018 election. The preparation need to be made in a view that it's connected with the 2019 presidential election in terms of institutional strength and the foundational work that's required for it. Unfortunately, we have missed a good amount of time, and this good amount of time is primarily an issue or a cause of the incompetencies on part of some of the institutions itself, rather than the absence of political will. We are happy to see that the political oppositions or political groups and individuals aspirant to the office are out there making outcries, demanding changes and an improvement to the process. And this is very healthy, and the government is really welcoming that. There'd been a time when the president was really engaged to make sure with all the stakeholders to get the process rolled out and to provide kind of support that the commission required. But at the same time, there was, as skepticism is there, some people were thinking, both, and especially among our international partners, that the president is so close to the commission. So he had to take a step back and allow and encourage the commission to take the lead more and more and be more active. And then there was a downside back. Things have slowed down because of incapacity within the commission. And then he was blamed, and as the government, we were blamed that there's a lack of political will. It's difficult all the time, and it's very complex, and you have to keep a very fine balance and walk on a very fine path to not give one or another perception that either you don't have political will or you are engaged in influencing. We are optimists that this week some of the key issues of incompetency within the Election Commission will be addressed and solved by the Commission itself, and if it requires a presidential decision on it, that strong political will is there to help them. And then in terms of the methodology, unfortunately, the electronic voting was not supported by some of our international partners, and therefore that was stopped. We will have a paper-based voter registration again, and then again a manually done voting. While the government is going to do a pilot project of biometric and electronic voter registration, will not stop that, and in a way that will not distract from the main work of paper-based voter registration. So all emphasis is to make sure that the next summer the election for parliament is convened.
Great. Any other questions? Right there. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask a question about the current development strategy by the Afghan government. And do you think that the Afghan government could use that to consolidate, not the international community, but since just to focus on the US government, their civilian assistance in a way that's going to be more effective than it was in the past? Is the Afghan government in a position to be able to convince the US government that instead of doing project-based interventions, they should support the priorities of the Afghan government? And do you think that this document is a more realistic development strategy than the previous ones?
Well, in terms of working with our partners in bringing them more over toward what our national strategy suggests in terms of development, at times could be challenging, but not if we are able to present the vision and explain the element of their strategy. And it's always political will at part of international partners to engage in the dialogue, and if we manage to convince, they would come forward. There are some of the steps we've taken as a government. This administration, one of the first things it did was to call upon its international partners to have the developmental budget more condition-based. And that means that we have with the United States something called the New Deal, where there are certain benchmarks on every priority areas that we have to meet. And once we met that amount of money that's been either earmarked or allocated for that area will be only then released either to the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund or directly to the Ministry of Finance. This is the modality that creates a double pressure over institutions and the government itself, while monitored by the president himself, to deliver on our commitment and to walk on the path of implementing the National Peace and Development Strategy and elements of the national priorities in different areas. There are discussions with other donors also. The balance between the amount of the fund that is channeled toward the national budget, on budget funds, and those who were not on budget and were primarily project and selective funding is also changing as we demonstrate more ability to financial management and ability to properly spend and burn money, or increase the burn rate of the funds properly on the development project. There is an agreement and consensus that the donors will walk on that path with us.
The second part of the question was, do you think it's a realistic document, development strategy?
Well, So far, it's been implemented in the areas that's implemented demonstrates that it is a realistic document. But none of the documents is called to be written on a stone. The Afghanistan's national strategy of anti-corruption that's recently been adopted, the National Peace and Development Strategy, the compact that we have entered, in addition to all other obligations and commitments we had with our partners, the compact that we entered with the United States, all of them are called living documents. And therefore, as we implement, we identify where it's lagging to achieve its objective, where it's not realistic. And this is a different culture of governance. When you sit in those high councils, from High Council of Economy to the rule of law and anti-corruption to the Human and Capital High Council, in each of those, it's a consistent process of deliberation of what actually being operationalized and what is the obstacle in this process, and how the whole of government effort can address some of those challenges that are out there that makes a strategy unrealistically. If it requires a modification of this strategy, then by adoption of the whole of the government and through the deliberation and examination of the implementation, that modification does happen. And it's a consistent work. Something that makes me proud and happy is, just to give you, is a decision by the High Council on Economy last month. And this is about how the environment has become conducive for the private sector to come and invest. After 2.5 years of a consistent work by the High Council, laying down each piece of support for the private sector's investment and growth in the country, finally we had, some of you may know, one of our business person, one of Afghans who is partially owning Afghan International Bank, one of the very healthy banks in the country, who is a very conservative investor, who has investments in the region, in AUE, the Emirates and Central Asia and other places, who comes forward to invest some probably in context of other countries. $65 million may not be a significant amount of investment, domestic direct investment, but in Afghanistan it's a significant one, and especially after a period of time where the investments has been limited and the political risk is still high. A very conservative investor like him, who have made the money through being smart and all of his money is clean, coming to invest $65 million in 6 production lines on construction goods, is a vote of confidence to the business environment and the government's ability to provide. He had 4 demands, and the way the High Council have prepared for it already before that, for him and for other investors, is unique and unprecedented. That 4 demand was the electricity, the land, the tax holiday for a certain period of time, and financing. And all elements of that, through the members of the High Council, was already prepared, and not only to him, but to other business and investors, it was offered. Obligations were always on the business community before. It's now for the government to not sell the land, but to provide us public-private partnership to the investors. Electricity, the electricity company, as the sole provider of utility, in the past, an investor had to pay $1 million to extend the line of electricity. Now it is the sole obligation of the company to provide that, but to agree part of that to a 20-year of small payments, where not the big chunk of money will be taken out of the investment. On tax holiday, we have already negotiated with the IMF, and there are certain agreements for certain threshold of investment. We can provide tax holidays for certain short period of time. A drive from only focusing on revenue generation to creating incentive for investment is a centerpiece of our next year's budget. So I think those strategies are living documents and would be modified where it's not realistic.
All right, so one last question.
Yeah, thanks. Paul Fishstein. My question is also related on the economic side. So much of the discussion in this country is obviously about the number of forces and how long they're staying, and the economic side often gets short shrift. I guess this is a question partly for Nader on the part of the Afghan government, and I guess maybe for Ambassador Cunningham and Vanda. I don't know who could speak for the U.S. government on this, but Ambassador Cunningham talked about the role of the forces, the international forces, in creating the space that could then be consolidated. On the aid side, the assistance side, what is it that the U.S. and other Afghanistan's development partners could best do to, support some of the economic, like the investment that you've talked about? Obviously, there are significant remaining obstacles to investment, including uncertainty, et cetera. But, Nader, you've talked about some of the things the Afghan government has done, but from the assistance side, how can we help? How can the U.S. government help? How can some of the development partners help? And it wouldn't necessarily, as was talked about before, mean sending thousands of people out on a surge into the countryside, but something more appropriate.
Well, from our point of view, with those economic assistance or development assistance, in the past they were scattered in small pieces and was spent in projects and programs that may have had an impact but could not help the country to generate or create a base for its economy to grow, and therefore to be not a burden for a long period of time. Currently, the priorities that the Afghan government is setting for its development, primarily on one area, is the infrastructure, because the key for the future development of the country and its economy to grow is its infrastructure. The United States have invested significant amount of funds in the past in major infrastructure programs. But currently, on our priority agenda, we have looked through all the areas of need and prioritized them in a way that each project is reinforcing the next part of it in paving ground for further investment and economic development. As an example, if roads and electricity are the two top infrastructure priority for us, they both reinforcing each other, but most importantly, attracting more investment and also our trade and creating that value chain that's required for the goods, especially on agriculture that we are producing in large quantity. And therefore, what we look forward is on the agriculture side, on the water management, on the other infrastructure side, on the roads and the electricity, the grid that we are connecting the 9 islands of electricity networks that we have to be connected there.
Ambassador or Vanda, do you want to comment on that one as well, in your last words?
I'll say the generating foreign investment as opposed to domestic economic activity, in my experience, and I'm not an economist or a businessman, but I've spent a lot of time talking to businessmen because we did spend a lot of time trying to do that and still are, I'm sure. There are 3 major impediments, all of which depend on the Afghans to address. The first is infrastructure. If you can't move around and move things in and out of the country or get the products that you might be developing inside Afghanistan out, that's a problem. Something that the Chinese and others who've bought into these future mineral exercises are going to have to deal with if they ever try to realize those projects. The second, obviously, is security. There are lots of countries in the world who operate in places where security is a serious issue, but we have not been able to figure out how to generate that kind of activity, that kind of cooperation within Afghanistan. There's a very troubled history in that regard with private security companies and others engaging there, which in my view, ought to be revisited. You have a new Afghan administration, a new international climate now. Just because private security generated problems in the past doesn't mean that it's not something that bears relooking. It's hard to imagine many international companies coming into Afghanistan without provision of proper security procedures, as the Chinese are finding in their endeavors in Pakistan, where the Pakistanis are going to have to stand up a very large security component to work with the Chinese, and I'm not sure if that's going to work or not. And then the third and one of the most important critical things is confidence in the legal system. And that's just not there. Maybe eventually, but it has been a real problem in the past with entities operating in Afghanistan who were service providers, who were shaken down by the Attorney General or other Afghan politicians at great difficulty to resolve. And without addressing the business climate and that sort of thing, you're not going to get very many companies willing to engage there. You may, however, get companies that are used to dealing in that part of the world to look at that, and that's something that I'm sure, I'm not involved in it anymore, obviously, but I'm sure our government's involved in trying to promote that now.
If I may just add one other element, for the international, and especially U.S. investors to be attracted, there was the beginning of the intervention, and especially at the early years, 2001 to 2005, an agreement where the U.S. government have encouraged OPIC to provide guarantee for the American investments to reduce the political cost for the investor. This is something that we really look forward with that. President Ghani have raised it with President Trump in New York, and we are following it up. So hopefully that will become an instrument for encouraging businesses to come, and especially in the mine sector, where most of the time the political cost of investing on mine sector in most places are very, very high. And if it is backed with this guarantee scheme, it will certainly encourage.
Vanda, any last words? All right. Please join me in thanking our panel today, and thank you all for coming.